In this Upfront Religion special, we'll discuss the crises facing Islam and Catholicism. I'll speak to a top Muslim scholar who's declared all suicide attacks un-Islamic and debate the future of the Catholic Church under Pope Francis. I'm Mehdi Hassan. He began his papacy just 4 years ago, but Pope Francis has already made a name for himself as a progressive pontiff. But is his more liberal approach to, say, people who get divorced or who are gay, creating a backlash? That's our debate. But first, Al-Qaeda, ISIL, the Taliban, they claim to follow Islam and to act according to the faith. But how Islamic are they? And have Muslim clerics done enough to push back against their murderous ideology? This week's headliner, one of Pakistan's top Islamic scholars who famously issued a fatwa banning suicide attacks, Dr. Tahir Al-Qadri. Tahir Al-Qadri, thanks for joining me on Upfront. In 2010, you wrote a 500-page fatwa, a ruling in Islamic law, condemning suicide attacks. And you said at the launch of that fatwa, quote, "Terrorism is terrorism, violence is violence. It has no place in Islamic teaching and no justification can be provided for it." What was your aim? What did you hope to achieve with that fatwa?
My basic objective, which I wanted to achieve, to change the mindset of those who have not become terrorists yet, but they are accessible to terroristic ideology. Just want to save them and to make them clear that the ideology and wrong concept of Islam on which all terrorist organizations and terrorist activities are based has no link with the teachings of Islam, no link with the teachings of Quran, and no link with the seerah and conduct of Holy Prophet of Islam. So these are two different ways of thinking.
Just to be clear, when you say violence is violence and it has no place in Islamic teaching, you're not the first Muslim scholar to say that, but a lot of Muslim scholars have been criticized for making an exception when it comes to Israel-Palestine, even going as far as to issue fatwas justifying suicide bombings against Israelis. Will you here today unequivocally, clearly condemn any and every suicide bombing against civilians, including in Israel?
Yes, I will say yes. I am absolutely clear and there is no change in my stance. The basic thing is that there may be a different point of view on international politics regarding Israel and regarding the matter of Palestine. It is totally unjust with the Palestinians, but at the same time, I will never allow any Muslim organization to attack on peaceful civilian populations, whether they live in any part of the world, including Israel, because non-combatants and peaceful civilians, you can never attack on them. This is a categorical commandment of the Quran and commandment of Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Since your 2010 fatwa on suicide bombings, of course, ISIL has appeared on the scene, proclaiming a so-called Islamic caliphate, launching a wave of horrific attacks, beheadings, bombings, burnings across the region and across the wider world, claiming their behavior is Islamic. Even in your own country of Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban have ramped up suicide attacks against civilians, against schools, hospitals, other civilian targets in recent years. 7 years on, your fatwa hasn't had much impact, has it?
Let me make clear that fatwa or a juridical ruling of a scholar or just juristic and academic works of a scholar, they are not only a sufficient source to change the whole mindset of the world. There are many other international political factors. There are many local political factors. There are international agencies working to create a lot of problems in different countries. They have their own global agendas. So they keep on creating a space for emergence of terrorism.
Tahir Al-Qadri, you've said that ISIL and the ideology behind ISIL has, quote, nothing to do with Islam. Now, a lot of people would agree that ISIL isn't representative of Islam, but to say it has nothing to do with Islam is just not true, is it? It does base its violent actions, its vicious brand of Islam on a distorted, politicized version of Salafi Islam. They do have texts and quotes from Muslim scripture that they use to try and back up their actions. There's no point in denying that, is there?
I will stick to my own statement. They have nothing to do with Islam. As far as your saying is concerned, they have link with Islam, and that link is link of enmity, link of distortion. They are distorting Islam. They are exploiting the name of Islam. They are misusing the name of Ummah. They are misusing the name of Islamic Caliphate. So they have, when I say nothing to do, they are no more representative of Islam, Quran, Sunnah and Ummah. They are enemies of humankind. They are enemies of Islam.
Okay.
They are.
We had Muwaffaq al-Rubai, the former Iraqi national security advisor, on the show recently, and he claimed that the back alleys of Saudi Arabia were the largest terrorist manufacturing plants in the world. He said ISIL was backed by the Saudis' quote, extremist Wahhabi ideology. Do you agree with him? A lot of people in the West seem to these days.
I am unable to comment on it. This is purely a matter which is related to informations. So I will stick myself on the ideology aspect of the conceptual aspect, and aspect whichever is related with the academic aspect of Quran.
Is that ideology being pushed by certain countries in the Middle East, is what I'm asking. You can comment on that.
I think that certain people, certain groups, certain powers are definitely pushing, they are behind promoting the ideologies for their own local agendas.
Will you name them?
I think you can understand and you know better than me.
No, that's not my job to guess what you're thinking. You wrote a 500-page fatwa. Surely you can spend 5 seconds naming the countries which you believe is pushing ISIS ideology.
I would say this ISIL ideology is not an isolated ideology. They have a background of terrorism. They are being supported. They are being financed within Muslim world as well as from outside of the Muslim world, both sides. And I will say there are some powers and certain blocks outside the Muslim world who claim to be fighting against terror, but on the other hand, for their own political agendas, one way or the other, they support. This terrorism and terrorist organizations have not emerged from a vacuum. Where they are getting the arms from, where they are getting finances, where they are getting every kind of support. I think there are such a big powers and nations in this world. If they want really to eliminate them, it is not a very difficult matter for them to terminate them within a couple of months.
Okay, Tahir al-Qadri, on the subject of moderation versus extremism, when you look at Islamic law and people talk about reforming Islamic law, in your country, Pakistan, which calls itself an Islamic republic, there is a controversial blasphemy law in place which has been associated with the death of at least 60 people over the last 3 decades. Just last month, it was used to sentence a man to death for something he wrote on Facebook. Do you support the death penalty, yes or no, for the crime of quote-unquote blasphemy in Pakistan?
So I'm very clear on this. I will tell you that my point of view is this blasphemy law has 2 aspects, and every law has 2 aspects which deal with the punishments. One is the adjective law, the procedural law, and one is the law which deals with the content. The content of the death penalty, it is not only related to that question, it is related to many other injuries and many other the acts of murder. The penalty, death penalty is allowed in Islam.
Okay, but I'm asking specifically about blasphemy. You said you were going to be clear on the issue of blasphemy. Do you support the death penalty as it is on the statute book in Pakistan?
Yes, the basic content of the punishment of blasphemy as death, this is, I agree, because this is the punishment given by Quran, and the same punishment has been awarded by Bible. This is the punishment which has been mentioned in Bible and Quran.
So you support putting to death someone who says something negative about the Prophet? Really?
No, but no, this is not the question. The way I disagree with the procedural law. The procedural law which is implemented in Pakistan, I disagree with that.
Okay, now let's be clear for our audience. The Pakistani Penal Code says, whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by visible representation, or by any imputation, innuendo, or insinuation, directly or indirectly defiles the sacred name of the Holy Prophet Muhammad shall be punished with death or imprisoned with life. Do you support that? A lot of people would say that's outrageous, to put someone to death for saying something negative.
No. The law says death or imprisonment for life.
Okay, so do you support death? I'm trying to get your view.
But
do you support killing someone?
But let me clear, the majority in Pakistan are Hanafis. And according to Hanafi Imam Abu Hanifa, this punishment is only awarded to a Muslim, not for non-Muslims.
I didn't say anything about non-Muslims. I'm talking about human beings. Would you put a Muslim to death? Would you support the execution of a Pakistani Muslim for saying something negative about the Prophet? Yes or no?
Anyone who is intentionally doing this, and challenging the authority and creating this kind of mistrust in the community of the Muslim Ummah, so this is in the same way would be death punishment as it is in case of the act of murder. But a lot of people watching around the world would say there's no comparison between saying something and killing someone. You can't, you're supposed to be a voice of moderation. A lot of people watching will say there's nothing moderate about supporting the death penalty for blasphemy in 2017. My voice of moderation is that the way this law has been made in Pakistan and the way it has been implemented, that is absolutely unjust. I think this law is being misused against
How is it unjust?
Against non-Muslim minorities, against Christians. This law is being misused by the political people, misused by the landlords, misused by the police people. But moreover, it needs reforms. The basic and fundamental reforms are required in the whole law. This whole law, which has never been addressed. These Pakistani rulers, they are not sincere in implementing the law of Islam in letter and spirit. Sometimes they do according to the needs and necessities of their own political will. They need reforms.
You're saying it's unjust and unfair when it's applied to minorities, to non-Muslims in Pakistan, but it's not unjust or unfair when applied to Muslims in Pakistan.
But in the same way, the procedure applied for the Muslims is also unjust. This is being tried by SHO. He is being bribed. So the first-class magistrate of district level should be the first investigator.
Okay,
so it is misused.
Badly, but you don't disagree with the principle of the death penalty for people who insult the Prophet?
Only the basic contempt, the principle of the death penalty, I don't disagree with that. But the whole procedure which has been adopted and which is being used in Pakistan, I totally disagree with that. That is totally exploitation of law and against justice and against the spirit of Islamic law.
Dr. Tahir Al-Qadri, thank you for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you very much.
Just 4 years since becoming head of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis's global popularity continues to grow, but so too do the controversies around him. The Pope's seemingly progressive positions on contentious issues such as divorce, abortion, and homosexuality continue to spark heated debates within the Church. So, has man of the people Pope Francis gone too far? Or is a vocal minority of conservatives simply trying to undermine him? Joining me to debate this are Austin Ivory, the author of a biography on Pope Francis entitled The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope, and Matthew Schmitz, the literary editor of the influential religious magazine First Things. He wrote that the Pope has built his popularity at the expense of the church he leads. Thanks both for joining me in the arena. Matthew, let me begin with you. What is your main objection, your issue with Pope Francis, given how popular he is with both Catholics and non-Catholics alike? You wouldn't deny that, would you?
No, I mean, he remains very popular. We have seen a slight increase in people who positively don't like him. Here's the issue that many people have. I'm a young Catholic, Mehdi. I'm a convert to the church who knows it to be beautiful and true. And when Francis was elected, I celebrated that election. I thought he would make a wonderful pope. The reason I've come to change my mind is that I've seen that Francis is building his program of supposed reform at the expense not only of the church, but also at the expense of its most vulnerable members, the children who have been orphaned by the culture of divorce, remarriage that was left to us by the 1960s and the baby boomers. It's those children who are objecting to Pope Francis now.
Austin, it's not just the church that's suffering as a result of the Pope, it's children too.
Yeah, I mean, this is really, really ridiculous, given not only Pope Francis's passion for the family, his enthusiasm for restoring the family, lifelong fidelity in marriage. He called 2 synods so that the church might better enable not just Catholics, but the whole world to recover the value of marriage at a time when law and culture has lost the meaning of lifelong fidelity. So the notion that he's in some way caving in to the culture of modernity or individualism is really, really not only kind of wrong, but it's just grotesquely to misunderstand the papacy. And I think this is the difficulty of people like Matt, and I've read his stuff, and I've seen how he's been turned off eventually by Pope Francis. What I read in what he says is that he has come to look at Pope Francis through, I think, the eyes of the American culture wars, and I think he's just got it wrong.
Okay, Matthew, isn't the problem here that the Pope and his supporters get that you have to move with the times, that trying to enforce conservative values in an increasingly liberal age is impossible? It's not a war you can win.
Is it an increasingly liberal age? Brexit, Trump, Viktor Orban, all these things would seem to militate against that idea. In my view, Francis is very much tied to an age, but it's an age that is currently passing. His papacy represents, to me and I think to many young Catholics, a revenge of the past, where a group of older cardinals who were very enthusiastic about the Church in the 60s and 70s after the Second Vatican Council have now tried to reassert a discredited version of Catholicism and bring us back.
Austin, let me put this point to you. The Pope isn't a liberal, is he?
No, exactly. Well, this is what I'm just trying to say. I mean, both of you are talking here as if Pope Francis is some kind of liberal who's adapting the church to the modern age. He's not. He's reforming the church so that the church can better evangelize the modern world. And, this idea that in some way he doesn't care about the children of divorced parents, he wants marriage to be lived in lifelong fidelity. This is all about the victims of divorce and enabling them to start again and live marriages. This is for the benefit of children. This is for the benefit of fidelity. And I say this is the problem. I mean, Matthew is looking at this through the eyes of this kind of contemporary idea that you either have to resist or surrender to the modern age. Pope Francis is coming from a continent, Latin America, which is predominantly poor and does not have in place the major institutions that we have in the rich world. And he's coming from a pastoral church that is very close to people in their suffering and in everything else. That's what he's bringing to the church.
If I may. Yes. So, Austin, in your biography, which I read and richly enjoyed and recommended, you present him as a reformer. And I think that those who voted for him to be Pope wanted him to reform. But that program of reform has stalled, even if we don't look at this one issue of divorce. Francis has backed off in a major way his effort to clean up the Vatican's finances, basically giving victory to the corrupt, entrenched bureaucrats there.
Your magazine, Matthew, First Things, your magazine recently published a piece which began, "Is the Pope Catholic?" It used to be an answer, not a question. Alas, it has become a question. Would you go that far yourself, Matthew? Would you question the Pope's commitment to Catholicism itself?
No, the Catholic Church is a very motley mix of people. There's no guarantee that someone who's Catholic is perfectly right all the time or perfectly moral all the time, but it is increasingly the case. So here's the question: what happens when the Pope builds his popularity by attacking established ways of expressing Catholic teaching, by shucking off all of the trappings of the office? Francis has increasingly removed himself from the dignities and the traditional formulas of the office, and that makes it harder for him to repel any criticism.
Well, I think here we're getting close to what really bothers Matthew. He wants the red shoes. He wants the popes to be carried on a sedia gestator. I mean, he wants a church which no longer exists, a church of the 1950s. The Pope is absolutely kept the dignity of the office, but he has brought the office of the papacy and the church close to the people. Physically, that's what he does all the time. The real reform of this Pope is in converting attitudes. An understanding that God is not just about truth and doctrine, but also about love and acceptance, and that is what deeply disturbs, I think, some people, particularly elites in America.
Okay, Matthew, love and mercy. What's wrong with that?
Nothing at all. But what's necessary is a true love and a true mercy. The scriptures talk about where mercy and justice meet, and and that's what we don't have in the church. There's been too much of what Catholics call kind of an antinomian impulse in Francis, a tendency to always suggest that the truth of the gospel and mercy is counter to the law. And this is a more Protestant idea. It's a more kind of radical Christian idea, and it's counter to the loving but all the same ritualistic nature of the Catholic Church. Great English anthropologist Mary Douglas, who I'm sure Austin knows, pointed out that it's very dangerous when the leaders of a ritualistic institution oppose themselves to ritual. They undermine the basis of their own authority.
Austin, let me ask you this. You mentioned U.S. culture wars and said Matthew's seeing it through the prism of the U.S. conservatives, U.S. Culture warriors. And yet, it's not just U.S. conservatives who disagree with the Pope's leadership on a lot of this. You have African archbishops from South Africa, from Kenya. You have archbishops from Mexico and Venezuela, all writing to the Pope saying, what are you saying here? Clarify what you mean. Are you changing doctrine on divorce, on other such issues? They're not happy with him.
No. Oh, well, there are conservative bishops and cardinals, of course, across the world. It's not geographically specific, and yet the volume and the vehemence of the criticism which is coming from Catholic conservatives, particularly wealthy conservative lobbies in the United States, is just deafening.
I'm ready to cash my check, but no one's offering me great piles of money.
No, of course they're not, Matthew, but you would accept that, I mean, your magazine and many of these Catholic foundations are very well financed. They have blogs, they have websites.
It's equally true on both sides. Austin, it's a non sequitur, and you know it. It's true on both sides.
Magazine.
It's true on both sides of the debate. To try to discredit conservatives as in someone's pocket is fundamentally dishonest.
I'm merely making the observation. I'm merely making the observation that when you look at where the criticism is coming from, the vehemence and the volume is much greater from the United States, from those sectors, than anywhere else in the world.
But it's not just the US.
But the critics of the conservatives are equally coming from the developed world, from London, from New York.
Well,
okay, Austin, finish your point.
I've just said conservative opponents are come from all over the place. But if you look
as do those on the other side, so your point is neither here nor there.
Okay, Austin, finish your point, and then I want to ask a follow-up.
My point is simply that the Pope has the overwhelming support of the world's bishops, and particularly those in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia.
How do you explain then their silence? Very few people, Austin, have defended.
Matthew, I will come back to you. Hold on, Matthew. Let Austin finish his point, and then I'll come back to you.
Do you mind if I just make this point? The Catholic Church now is predominantly a developing world church. It is a place of where the poor majority of the world live. And Pope Francis is increasingly reflecting the style, the temperament, the attitudes of the majority of the Catholics. And this is what needs to be understood by Matthew, who yearns for a particular kind of church, which frankly is very, very culturally and historically isolated and no longer exists.
But Austin, let me ask you this. Is the Pope, Austin, trying to have his cake and eat it? He makes these progressive, liberal-sounding noises, which win in hearts and minds, which win... Well, they are liberal-sounding. I think a lot of liberals like him because they think he's a reformer. Well, hold on. Your book is called A Great Reformer. They think he's a reformer. And then he carries out a fundamentally conservative, traditionalist agenda. He backs a referendum in Slovakia to oppose gay people adopting children. So he
opposes gay adoption. He opposes gay marriage. He upholds Catholic teaching. There isn't a single.
Are you telling me he doesn't give out the image of being different to liberals and people on the left? Are you seriously telling me?
I think that's a good question.
Matthew.
Francis is called in some quarters the cool Pope. It's a joke among young leftists because he's trying to rebrand something that fundamentally cannot change. It'll be as successful as New Coke. Coca-Cola went back to the original formula.
Austin, let me ask you this. After the Pope goes, will it revert to what it was before? Will he leave? You know, we've seen Barack Obama followed by Donald Trump. Will Pope Francis be followed by a much more conservative traditionalist?
The answer is I don't know, because when the cardinals gather to elect the new pope, they read the signs of the times. There are all kinds of deliberations that go into that. But my own view is that the reforms which he has unleashed, which have a very, very broad consensus from the cardinals and the bishops across the church. Indeed, they mandated him to bring about those reforms, at least a lot of them. He is putting in place those reforms which will be continued by the next pope. I think actually the shift that Pope Francis has introduced, and I agree it is a significant shift, is not an adaptation to modernity. It is the recovery of a deeper tradition within the church, which sadly some people who have a particular idea of what the church and the Pope should be simply don't recognize.
Okay.
And every Pope builds on a predecessor. The next one will build on Francis.
We'll have to leave it there.
This is not, there is no rupture. There is no rupture.
Several times
Matthew,
you
last
said
word,
that,
very briefly.
Yes, thank you. That young Catholics want to go back to some forgotten version of the church. I think it's actually Francis who is the nostalgist, trying to bring us back to a time in the church that has passed, that of the 60s.
Thank you both for joining me on UpFront here in the arena. We'll have to leave it there. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.